Welcome to another episode of Cultivate. This is a show about you and your journey in the cannabis industry. It's moving fast, but there's room for everyone. Buckle up as we bring you the people and the technology that are blazing the trail. Super excited today to be welcoming Andrew Samann from Orin GMP to the Cultivate Live podcast, broadcast live. Andrew, thanks for joining us. How are you, brother?
I am doing well. Thank you, Drew. How about yourself?
I'm doing well as well. And part of my excitement is that we've had some really bright people on Cultivate, and I think we may be setting a precedent of having perhaps the brightest guy that we've had on Cultivate to date. So not to give you a lot of pressure to sound smart or anything. Andrew Samann, listed recently by the Cannabis Scientist on the Power List for 2021. That's a big deal.
It's a pretty big deal.
It's a pretty big deal. And then going through your resume and looking at all the shows that you have spoken at, whether they were live shows back in the old days when we used to have live shows, or all the virtual stuff that you have done, representing the scientific community in cannabis. Really impressive, man. Congratulations.
Thank you. I'd say, like I've said every time, it's an absolute honor, and it's just so exciting to be able to, literally go around the world and speak to people about this plant where it used to be illegal. So I'm just honored, totally.
So no slam against scientists, but it's always really awesome when you meet a scientist that also has a personality that you can captivate your imagination. So I'm going to focus on speaking less and having Andrew speak more, but I'm just going to prompt him with a few questions and see if we can't go down a journey. I want to start with your haircut.
Okay.
It reminds me of when you were a Marine. And you served in the U.S. Marine Corps.
That is correct. Yeah.
And one of the things that I find really endearing about your resume is the interest that you have taken in veterans, and it's an interest that Boveda also has in veterans. We've always supported veterans with different programs to access cannabis for veterans that don't have access. We've worked with a number of groups. And we've provided a lot of Boveda to send cigars for warriors over to in theater to have those guys enjoy a smoke while they're at work on break over there doing their duty for our country. I mean, how cool is it that you consider vets to be that important and that you support them? Tell us just a little bit about that, and then we'll go get sciencey.
Yeah, the whole veteran side of the cannabis industry became very interesting from the very beginning for me. After I got out of the Corps, I started cultivating in San Diego, and met one vet after another that has had really positive experiences with cannabis. And in a lot of ways, when I look down into like the roots of it, what is it that really what is it that makes it effective? And part of it is obvious, and it helps people forget, if you will, what they've gone through. And that became really like one of the biggest sticking points for me, because I served with several veterans that took their lives afterwards, or after they got out of the military. So it's become something that's really important for me to, out of my own personal experiences, being in the Marines, I've never felt such a sense of purpose in my life. And then once I got out and I just started going to school, I had a purpose, but nothing that was like living at the knife's edge. So I think that's something that, a lot of veterans struggle with, and just like going from an environment where they're highly valued and they have a very important purpose to one where you really have to make it on your own, and you don't have that cohesive unit that you learn to live by in the military. So it really seems to me that, our warriors in the United States and around the world, they have to do jobs that are really difficult, and it leaves a significant impact throughout their entire life. And I can say for myself, like, being trained as a Marine, it's something that gives me a lot of initiative still, where I know there's nothing I can't do when I put my mind to it. And that's something that I really cherish about, my veteran friends and all veterans really, because usually they still have that initiative and drive. So they're a great group of people to work with and help in any way possible.
Well, thank you for your service. All respect for that. That's awesome. Now let's go back to San Diego. You get out of the Corps, you start cultivating, and were you scientifically interested in the plant before that?
No, I was actually on a track to study geology because I absolutely love the natural environment, mountains, rocks, seeing the world underneath the sea, if you will, diving, things like that. So I thought for sure I needed a life that would take me to the extremes of the environment. But that's really where it started. And as I started taking my science courses and I had these plants growing and I was sitting there looking at them and I was just, captivated by them. And I started asking some very serious questions of how is it that this plant that I'm growing holds my attention so much that I would care for it every day, open up the door, water each plant, look at it, feel it up and down, see where it's healthy and it's not healthy. And that really drove me towards studying chemistry and biochemistry. And it just became obvious when I started asking some of the questions when I was, at San Diego City College, community college there. And my chemistry professor, who I was doing a lot of work for as a teaching assistant, she was like, you need to study biochemistry, probably a mix of plant biology and human physiology. And, I pretty much took off with it from there. And
so when you were taking care of these plants, you were touching these plants, were you tasting these plants?
Well, once they were harvested and properly stored and cured and ready for consumption.
So then you had a happy relationship with cannabis and the impact that it had on you personally.
Yeah, completely. I was going through a lot of changes at that time. And, it was something that I was able to use to help me with meditation and letting go of things. So it was an integral part. I guess what surprises me now is to see things come full circle, where I started growing, DJ Short's blueberry and popped 10 seeds. And then here we are 15 years later, and DJ lives a few hours away from here and is a fellow colleague. So to see those things happen, I'm just standing back in gratitude. How does this happen?
So does it crack you up how small the cannabis world is? I mean, as much as it's grown, how small and tight-knit the community is?
Yeah, I feel, I guess on the science and standards side, I feel it's really tight there. And I know there are a bunch of other areas where it's a really tight-knit community. And you'd see people in the past when you'd go to live events and it's all right, I've seen you at 3 of these. So, hey, we must be part of the same crew. But on the science side, for sure, I feel like I've got a family. I don't go somewhere or, get on a webinar without bumping into a few people I know.
So a lot of developments in the last couple of years. Last year, the U.S. Pharmacopoeia included cannabis for the first time, and that's important. And you can riff on that if you want. But other things that happened, ASTM Standards started a committee a couple of years ago focused on cannabis. You served on that committee?
Yeah, yep. A lot of interesting things there from USP, World Health Organization, even the European Union Pharmacopoeia, European Union Good Manufacturing Practices, and ASTM. There are a lot of different standards groups out there, and then also the application of standards. So starting here at home with the USP, they've done a ton of work on herbal dietary supplements. Volumes and volumes have been written. These general chapters are available for free online. Anyone can go and look at them. And it's really cool because as you see the cannabis industry progress, it's well, check. We get more and more information of what we need to adequately analyze, cannabis flower, even though it's, just one of many products, but it starts building up that repertoire of test methods and how we characterize it and say what's good and what's not good. And then relating back over to ASTM, we've got the water activity standard, which is incredibly important. I think it's underappreciated of, what does it mean to combust a plant or, an herbal drug and then have beneficial effects from it. And even things, other than beneficial effects, the harshness of smoke and things like that, I think are directly related to the water activity and water content. And a lot of people back that up. Do we have, absolute data to prove it? No, but there's enough anecdotal data standing behind it that it's a serious issue. So I'm really excited to see more standards come out along those lines where we're actually able to measure the quality attributes more so than just looking at it as a percentage of THC and then, grading a product from there.
So I was always naturally cynical about standards because my fear was that it would be something concocted by a bureaucrat or somebody that doesn't have a personal relationship with the plant, somebody that isn't friendly to the culture, the cannabis culture. I've seen so many regulatory debacles over the years with various regimes of regulation. I thought of standards that way too. I just looked at them as another, and I don't mean to sound like, I'm some anti-government guy, but it's probably close, a little on the libertarian side, if you will. But talk about standards and why it's important to have the right standards as this industry matures from, you talked about anecdotal evidence earlier. Most of what we have for scientific evidence about cannabis is largely, I would qualify as lore. It's people's traditional experience with growing and consuming, and the amount of scientific data that's available is just beginning to be captured. I don't see a tremendous resource of scientific data available to date. Am I missing? I mean, I'm sure there's more today than there was 10 years ago, but is it as sparse as it feels to me?
Yeah, I'd agree. We keep pretty close tabs at Orion on what's going on with current literature and research. We've actually got a little bit of a program going on with the Northern Michigan University's Medicinal Plant Chemistry Club. And we literally are looking at every article out there, building a database that we share with them, because we ultimately use a lot of the scientific evidence to justify what we're doing within GMP. And when there's, well-documented research that says do it this way because the outcome will be as such, we recognize that. So that, I think, is a good thing. On the standard side, how much time do you have? Because that is it's a mess. There are so many different groups that are aiming to make different standards, and it's tough to really tell which standards are good and which ones are bad. So for the most part, from our perspective, we can go to different places. We can go to AOAC, we can go to ASTM, USP, European Pharmacopoeia, you name it. In regard to the concern about standards and their impact on the industry, I think that for the most part, the standards as they're written will either have utility in the marketplace or not. So a standards generating organization can write a bunch of standards, but they may turn out to be useless in practical application. In their worst form, I'd hate to say I lose sleep over standards, but I do get worried about standards that are written that can hold back, let's say, growers or operations in developing countries. And that's probably one of the biggest risks, because when we write a standard related to, a quality management system, and we write into it that your quality assurance manager, director shall have this education and this experience, it might be something that's not really attainable in a country that has long, history of growing cannabis, but none of pharmaceutical manufacturing. So I get concerned on that level more than I do on the individual standards. So that's kind of my perspective.
You're watching Cultivate Live from Boveda, and I'm with Andrew Samann from Orin GMP. And you should tell us about Orin GMP. GMP means good manufacturing practices. And where did you come up with the name Orion, and what do you do?
Well, being an early riser, I would see the constellation every day when I would wake up to take my dog out and usually start my day's work. So that's really where it started. And beyond that, it came about 6 years ago now. In 2015, I left the pharmaceutical industry because I saw a huge opportunity. Orion actually got started while I was on a motorcycle trip, of all things, and drove out from Michigan to the Continental Divide in Colorado. And my buddy and I rode over the Continental Divide. I think I was in Leadville and stopped off to buy some recreational cannabis. Saw next to a medicinal cannabis, and there was no pesticide testing required on the medicinal cannabis. And as a pharmaceutical quality control chemist, I knew that that was not good and that there was a huge opportunity there and in between if regulators were making what I thought was a mistake, which was quite obvious. So really from there, I started looking at every single pharmaceutical guideline that I had ever known. And it was very fortunate because I was trained in the International Conference on Harmonization, which is really the Bible for pharmaceutical manufacturing from A to Z, and was able to apply that in every direction for the various product categories that you would see cannabis fall into. Is it a pharmaceutical? Is it a dietary supplement? Is it a food? Is it a cosmetic? And really, it took several years of hardcore research trying to bend my logic backwards from what I knew as the most stringent guidelines to say, hey, what are reasonable justifications to demonstrate that the product is actually safe for the consumer, and not necessarily trying to go high and to the right and apply pharmaceutical manufacturing to something that just doesn't fit inside that box. So therein, there's still a lot of open and gray territory, but we've adapted. Orion GMP has been around for quite some time. It's literally first to market in cannabis for GMP, and then I've personally done a bunch of certifications that have enabled European Union distribution, and we keep on marching around the world. We're in South America quite a bit now, with helping manufacturers distribute and make sure that they've met all those requirements. So I'd say of the coolest stuff we've got going on, it's literally documenting things from A to Z for pharmaceutical grade cannabis out of South America.
So people hire you, companies hire you, brands or cultivators or government agencies hire you?
Well, I've definitely spoken to a bunch of government regulators, and I've got a funny conversation about that some other time. But typically, we're hired by companies that could be producing any of those products that desire to be able to sell to relatively sophisticated clients that are demanding good manufacturing practices, so that they're not selling something that can make someone sick. Otherwise, the regulatory issue is often another one. If we're talking about international jurisdiction, outright, you have to have GMP.
And then do you also go into facilities and analyze processes and look at workflows and all that to make sure that people are using the best practices, the GMP standards, or how would you explain that?
Yeah, that's probably the most interesting part of what we do, and what is almost universal of what we do. You have to have an understanding of the process. So we do go in and look at metrics and try to understand, how well is a process operating, and really get down to the numbers of it. For example, drying is a really big issue that we're approaching, and it's one where there can be a pretty significant loss in revenue if cannabis flower is over dried. We've got a complete calculator. We've done the math through and through and looked at multiple operations where there's dry flower, and then when we break it down to them and say, well, this is how much you're losing per kilogram, it starts to hit their radar pretty quickly. And there are a number of different examples. It's funny though, because like in most cases, after we see a problem and we can identify it by the numbers, it often comes down to, basic failures, or let's say when things cost money, it's usually due to lack of planning. And the cannabis industry is just moving so fast that people end up making quick decisions that cost them money that they wouldn't have realized on the front end.
So a year ago, January, I think the conversation or the narrative in the cannabis industry was all about access. Everything up to that point had been about either medical or adult consumption access to cannabis all over the world.
Yeah.
The narrative shifted last year. Somewhere between January and June, the narrative shifted to terpenes.
Yeah.
Did you notice that, or is it just me? I mean, did it really happen, or was I just imagining it? But terpenes have become the buzzword in the cannabis industry. Everybody is talking terpenes.
I would have to agree. I think it's a significant component of the active ingredient profile when you consider like what's most abundant. Cannabinoids by a percentage, and then they're followed by terpenes, and then there are other volatiles that we might not think of immediately, but can also influence, fragrance and taste. So terpenes are huge, and it's almost an ambiguous area because when you think of like aromatherapy, it's been around for a very long time, and a lot of it's just based off of volatile organic compounds, just like terpenes. It boils off all the time, just blowing off the surface of liquid. So terpenes are certainly important, and we know this from a lot of scientific research that's been done. I don't think it's comprehensive through and through that we can pinpoint and say, hey, when you consume this concentration of terpenes with these concentrations of cannabinoids, that you're going to get the specific effect. Like, I think we're on the heels of that, but I think that's the major reason why we're hearing more and more, because there is early data out there. One of our advisors, Dr. John Abrams, and his group, the CESC, had put on a small study out of Oregon and analyzed the data. And it was cool because we were able to look at the individual's endocannabinoid systems and then compare it to their brainwave functions and watch brainwaves speed up or slow down. This is all presented at the Emerald Conference, I think 2 years back now. But when you start seeing those types of things and knowing that there are different humans with different endocannabinoid systems, and then you've probably got like a palette of, let's say at least 9 different profiles that you can consume on a spectrum of terpenes in cannabis flower, it makes for a very complicated system to study. But what's cool is we know that people have different experiences with different varieties. And, if we were to just throw it out there as like indica or sativa, we know that people have different, reactions to it. So
what we know, people have had experiences with different cultivars, and they think that because they liked Jack Herrera that they bought in Colorado, in Leadville, next to the medical dispensary that you were at when Orion was birthed. They go to California and they pick up Jack Herrera in California, and they don't have necessarily the same experience. Yeah. But it's called Jack Herrera.
Yeah.
And they thought, like, if I go to CVS to buy ibuprofen in Minneapolis, it's the same ibuprofen that I'm buying in Los Angeles. But depending on the terroir, which may include water, I'm going to say water additionally, and the way it's fed and the way it's nurtured, and you can get dramatically different outcomes that have the same cultivar name.
Right.
That's problematic.
Drew, that's just the way God made it.
Okay, well, moving right along. Thank you. Thank you, Lord. It's intriguing though when you think about regulation and government, and I'm looking forward to the plant being removed from Schedule 1 of the schedule. I'm not looking forward to the FDA having jurisdiction over the plant. I find that to be terrifying just because I've dealt with the FDA before, and I love local control. I love the states having their sovereignty over these matters.
Yeah,
Again, call me a libertarian, but
I'm there with you.
where do you see this going in the short term? I mean, we've got everyone raves that now we have the administration that's going to be able to do this, that, and the other thing for the cannabis industry. I personally know a lot of people from the right side of the aisle that were pretty excited about delisting and deregulation and building businesses. If you go to Oklahoma, there were an awful lot of MAGA hats walking around those CannaCon conferences that had bought cultivation licenses and were raising crops.
Right.
So what do you see short term?
Okay. On the first one with my joke answer, I should say it's really important. Jack Career comparison from one jurisdiction to another. I think you're spot on. Like Terroir is a huge influence. This is something where, we've studied this. We've looked at how cannabis flower looks from, Colorado to California, difference in expression of cannabinoids and terpenes. We've been working with the Grow Off, Save the Terps, of course. And what we're seeing across the board is that, different conditions will lead to a different product. And when we think of like what's actually standardized, the best practices for cultivation for any specific variety to make it, come out the same way every time requires a lot of control and coordination that might not be feasible for large scale manufacturers that produce, massive quantities that require scaled up techniques. And I can say for sure, between something that's grown organically and something that's grown on salt-based nutrients, the flavor is just different. So those things really need to be considered, and, a consumer at this point should not expect to get the same product from one jurisdiction to the next.
Should people be worried about safety in terms of cannabis consumption? I mean, this came up the other day on Clubhouse. There was a room dedicated to cannabis hypermesis syndrome, and a young woman that I know who's a tremendous proponent for the industry, a very supportive, cannabis-friendly, pro legalization, pro, get rid of the stigma type of a person. She's awesome. But she's got CHS, and she was just making a comment that it's not all good news. There are some limitations that need to be at least honored and recognized in terms of individuals' ability to consume cannabis, either in the method with which they consume or the results that they get. So is it all good news as far as cannabis is a cure-all for everything? We can all just benefit greatly from this, or should we have some measured suspicion about a possible downside?
Yeah, I think that scarfs back over to the other question of how the FDA will look at it and the very questions that they're asking. I do not think that breathing in hot gases is ever a good thing. And I'm pretty sure every medical doctor that ever existed would agree with me. Smoking is bad. So that's a significant downside to start with. Second to that, if we think of like oral ingestion or topical routes of administration, the risk goes down. But it's not as though we know how one's body will respond to cannabinoids or whatever else ends up within any type of drug product or however you classify it. So I don't believe for a second that cannabis is free of health effects or consequences. But I mean, for a while I was blasting hash, and then I had to ask myself the question, do I know exactly what's coming out every time? And then I completely put the brakes on it. So before I started Orion, I mean, I moonlighted quite a bit, between cultivation and being a pharmaceutical chemist and developing my own equipment to do set extractions. But really, we just don't know what it means to dab concentrate and put that hot gas in your lungs. You can just look at a water pipe or, you know, a dab rig and see what it looks like when the end is burned, and it doesn't look good.
Well, and the argument that you'd get back from an avid consumer would be that it's an extremely effective way to cross the barrier into the bloodstream through the lungs.
Yeah,
So the efficiency is high, but your argument is worthy of consideration as far as the side effects.
I'd leave it right there.
Yeah, and I find myself a bit mystified when I hear people just. I love to say I hate all sweeping generalizations, which in itself is a sweeping generalization, if you see the humor there. But whenever somebody's just like, "Oh, weed's great and everybody's got to have access to weed," it's like there's a medium here. There's a place where we can all get along, and we've come a long way in terms of the incremental legalization, normalization of cannabis across the states. Canada, from sea to shining sea, has done a great job in some respects. And then on the other hand, the number one complaint in Canada today is that 80% of the cannabis flower that's purchased at retail is too dry. And we've done a lot of research in our R&D. I know you're connected to our R&D people. Do we have research today, clinical, scientific, replicable research, hypothesis proven again and again, that shows the impact of using our product to protect cannabis flower?
Well, I'd say it's ongoing. When it comes down to it, there are a few issues that we need to consider with the Boveda product. One is that it maintains a specific water activity, which I think then relates to the combustion profile, let's say. The second is retention of terps, where we know that there's a monolayer of water that forms over the trichome that basically is like a little cap that protects the trichome from the volatiles just gassing off. So it's a really cool equilibrium back and forth to the surface of the trichome. And then ideally you're reducing the volatilization, you're preserving the active ingredients. So like, I know for a fact these are all good things. And to the extent that it's been necessary to prove that those things work, it's there. And
could you prove it scientifically in a lab?
So where my mind goes when I think of like where would I want to demonstrate the efficacy of the Boveda product is on long-term health effects of smoking too dry of cannabis, because it's my opinion, and this is all in the stage of a hypothesis, right? We'll just leave it there. I hypothesize that when people consume too dry of cannabis consistently, it will damage tissue at a greater rate than that's properly cured and at a proper water activity level, moisture content, whichever way you want to look at it. How, resilient is that bud when you squeeze it? Does it press back out, or is it like poof, dust? And I really think that smoking the dust form is dangerous. So.
Well, and that's the way it is. If you go to Colorado, the vast majority of flower consumed in Colorado, they call it Colorado crumble for a reason. It vaporizes. You snap your fingers on it, and it's dust.
No grinder needed.
No grinder needed. And the people that we deal with that have tried our product to keep their cannabis at a particular water activity level have come around to the notion that even though the bouquet may be suppressed, when you open the bag and take that traditional nose hit off it, oh, dude, that's dank. Oh, wow, yeah. But that gets suppressed when it's properly humidified.
Yep.
But then when they consume it or they grind it, they get that bouquet back, or they get they come to the conclusion that the terpenes are that much richer than they were with the parched product?
I think you bring up a good point, and people have this expectation of opening a bag and it just explodes in their face, but I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. What that means to me is that the cannabis was relatively warm at some point, or it could have been warm. I'll just put it that way. If it's warmed up, the faster it's going to gas off. But if those gases are sitting inside of a bag or whatever container they're coming in, and then you smell it first, well, that pretty much means that you've just got a whiff of the active ingredients that no longer exist on the plant.
Right. I tell people you're smelling history.
You're smelling history of what was once good.
That is the aroma of what was.
Yeah, completely.
And they never go back into the plant. At least I haven't heard anybody, scientist or not, explain to me,
no,
even if you squint your eyes, that those terps are going back into the flower.
No.
Once the volatiles escape, they're on their way.
Yeah, I mean, you can literally just like reason through it with like the amount of energy it would take to get back into the trichome relative to just hanging out in the bag. Like, it's like 1 in a billion will go back in. Yeah, I agree, but no, it's not going to work in principle.
So let's go nuts on science for a second. There's two things that I found in doing some homework on you, which I was really delinquent in doing because I've heard you give presentations. Your bona fides are fabulous, and I have a high level of, I feel like I have, even though I've never met you, I have a personal connection to you, and I really respect you, so I didn't feel like I had to do that kind of homework.
Totally.
But there was a piece that you did on hash oil extraction in consideration of temperature and time.
Yeah.
That was mind-blowing. Was that for the Emerald Conference, or was that for something else?
No, I think that was something I wrote in like 2015.
So the Emerald Conference trip was the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic properties. Do you remember this? Because it was a trip to read, and you talked about delivery methods, concentrations, and dose-dependent relationships.
Yeah,
all of that. This is all part of your wheelhouse.
Yeah. So really, we can't. We need to think of where this is all going, and being in GMP in the first place, it's kind of like this, it's a bridge that you have to pass over, and once you get over that, there are opportunities all over the place. So if you know what your drug product is, then you are able to then measure how it responds in the human. And this is where I think, I see a very big gap in the industry where there isn't adequate understanding or characterization of the drug products. And then they're given to humans, and back to your Jack Herrera example, when it's different every time, we really have a tough time measuring anything downstream. So the way that Orion really works in its best fashion is that we lay the groundwork and foundation for companies to be able to make label claims and substantiate those. Because if they don't, like GMP, it looks like a bunch of documentation. In my opinion, you could burn it all if you know everything about what your product is and you make it consistently to the same spec every time. But nonetheless, here we are. So we make sure that we know that drug product through and through, and then we hand it over to much more qualified and intelligent people than ourselves, like Dr. John Abrams and Dr. Jean Talleyrand, who are then able to take it into clinical trials. And that's really where it starts to get interesting. And, if you don't have the basics down, like knowing what is your storage container, and that you're going to use it for a long time, how long is your product good for on the shelf? Do you know whether or not it's degrading in the conditions you're storing it in? Because if you screw those things up, and then you try and take it into a clinical trial, or let's just consider the consumers that get different products every time, no one's going to be happy, or the results of a study could cost you millions of dollars, and then you never get any of the value you intended in the first place to prove that the stuff works in a human.
We got a question from first-time caller, long-time listener, Claire Erickson. She says, what do we currently know about the shelf life of cannabis flower. Do you believe a shelf life claim will be important to the industry? Why or why not?
Okay, that is a good question. Thank you, Claire. So, at present, shelf life of cannabis and even cannabinoids is relatively limited. There was this really cool study of contaminated hash in it was somewhere in Europe, and they found all the different methods of transportation of it and how much it degraded. And it turned out that there were some type of microorganisms that you would never expect on hash that was smuggled around the area. But it was cool because it was one of the earliest, degradation studies that was done. Basically, just seeing what's out on the market. So to date, for the most part, people have been looking at cannabinoids in reference to stability in establishing shelf life, which I think is a very good and important first step. But it is absent of considering, terpenes, which we know for a fact have significant influence on the therapeutic response, or let's say the recreational experience someone has. So I'd say at present we're working on it as an industry. I haven't seen anyone put shelf life claims on their cannabis flower from their own stability studies. In most cases, it's been arbitrarily assigned by some regulatory. It could be a regulatory body or just looking for some number that sounds good. For example, Health Canada put, I think, 12 months on it to start with in 2014 or 15, and that was arbitrarily assigned. So it's not as though someone said, hey, cannabinoids and terpenoids are going to degrade in here and then it's going to go bad. So there's a long way to go, I think, still for cannabis flower and establishing its shelf life.
Well, and we'd be very interested in doing that type of work with someone like you. So if maybe we should talk about that offline afterwards.
I think that would be the coolest project ever.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
I want you to come back. We're going to cut shortly because we have the 1 hour or less short attention span theater. And I want to invite you to come back, and I want you to sit with Damian Solomon, the plant geek. I want to get more into the plant. I want to get more into the just educating people about some of the basics. I know it must get tiresome for big brain people like you to keep going back to teaching 101 level courses in this stuff, but there's a hunger for it. And there's a lot of people that talk very authoritatively from a zero base of knowledge about the plant, and it gets on my nerves. And I'd love to help people be more equipped with facts and have opinions that are properly formed based on reasoned research and input from people like you. Would you be willing to do that with us at a future date?
I would love to do that with you and Damian. Thank you for the opportunity, Drew.
So let's plan that, and we'll get that on the calendar. But if you could just recap in brief what Orin GMP does, how people can contact and contract Andrew Samann to assist them with their cannabis-related projects, that would be helpful.
In a sentence or two. So Orin GMP is a pharmaceutical consulting firm that focuses on cannabis flower quality and cannabis product quality first, and then relates that back to practical good manufacturing practices without being overbearing on defining what documents exist, but recognizing they're still important. So looking into product quality and safety first, and then scaling that into operations for long-term sustainability. We can be reached in a few different venues. One is on our website, www.oringmp.com, and otherwise email at info@oringmp.com. Those would be the best ways.
Dude, I could listen to you all afternoon, and I will look forward to doing this again with you and other guests as we try to bring the people and the technology that are blazing a trail to the cannabis industry. And thank you for tuning in and joining us on Cultivate Live, and we wish you a good day.